All right, so we now have 30 participants with us. We can get it started. Next slide, please. So once again, welcome to the IEU Virtual Talk for this month. Since March is the Women's History Month, as you know, we thought that it's very appropriate to dedicate the theme of the talk to gender in climate change. And of course, we celebrated International Women's Day on March 8th, and I do hope every one of you had a very meaningful and wonderful International Women's Day this year. So today's talk is titled Gender in Climate Change, Perspectives from WOCAN and GCF. So today we feature two special speakers. First, Dr. Jeannette Gurung from WOCAN, and WOCAN is Women Organizing for Change in Agriculture and Natural Resource Management. And we also have Ms. Seblewongel Deneke from the Green Climate Fund, and she is the Gender and Social Specialist from the GCF. Next, please. Some housekeeping before we get started. So please ensure that your mic is muted when you are not speaking. And please feel free to send us your questions via the Zoom chat box throughout the event. We will do an open Q&A towards the end. And of course, we will try to cover as many questions as possible then. And if you want to ask a question directly to any of the speakers, you can use the raise hand button of Zoom, and I will give you the floor. So you can ask a question directly also during the open Q&A towards the end. Once again, please feel free to tweet about today's event. The Twitter handle for the IEU is @GCF_eval, and the event hashtag is #IEU Talks. Next, please. Briefly on today's program. So after my opening and introduction, we would like to show you our special video dedicated to the International Women's Day this year. I think it's very appropriate, and it sets the tone, sets the scene for today's discussion. So that'll be good. It's just a 2-minute video. And then we will ask Dr. Jeannette Gurung from WOCAN to talk to us about how to address gender and climate change at the same time, simultaneously. And then we will go to Ms. Seblewongel Deneke for her intervention as discussant. And then we will do a Q&A at the end. Next, please. So more on the two speakers that we have today. Dr. Jeannette Gurung is the founder and executive director of WOCAN. She has been an innovator at the nexus of gender equality and climate-related sectors for 3 decades. So we are very lucky to have her today with us. She has expertise in certification and standards, monitoring and evaluation, training, research, gender and organizational analysis, policy advocacy, and networking. And Ms. Seblewongel Deneke is our gender and social specialist from GCF. She comes from Ethiopia, and she has more than 20 years working towards addressing gender issues in agriculture, food security, forestry, good governance, and private sector, among other things. And she has led and been involved in strategy and policy development, project program design, implementation, and supervision works. So she's going to also tell us about the GCF's own policies and tools aimed at mainstreaming gender in climate projects. Okay, next, please. So as I announced before, we would like to show you this special video from the IEU. We asked the women of the IEU, what does International Women's Day mean to you? And this is what they said. Let's take a look.
Happy Women's Day.
Women's Day for me is a celebration of how far we've come, but it also serves as a reminder of how far we still need to go to achieve gender equality globally.
For me, Women's Day is an additional reminder that we can do whatever we want. We can dream of whatever we want, however big or however little that thing is. And us being women should not be and is not an obstacle for us obtaining that.
For me, this is a day to celebrate passion, courage, struggle, and determination. It's a day to emphasize that women empowerment and women's rights are not an add-on to development, but a core to development of nations. It's a day to celebrate women's achievements all over the world.
Women comprise 70% of the global health workforce, yet they hold only 25% of senior decision-making role.
Every woman who steps forward makes small space for the women who come next. With that said, congratulations to Dr. Ngozi Okojo-Iweala on becoming the first female head of the World Trade Organization.
8th of March is for celebrating all women, but especially my grandma. She is one of the toughest women I know, and she turns 89 today.
So this year I want to celebrate the fact that I am fully independent, the fact that I can be happy with my life, and this is the life that I want for myself. I love the fact that I can make decisions about my life, and then I can live the kind of life I want to live. In the past, I didn't do that. I let the opinions of others dictate my own choices, and so this is really important for me, and that's why this year's Women's Day is all the more special, and I'm gonna celebrate it big time.
Happy Women's Day!
All right, so we hope you enjoyed that 2-minute video. As you could see, we are a very diverse group here at the IEU, and the answers that all the interviewees gave in the video are also very diverse. And I particularly liked my colleague Fatima's saying that women's empowerment should not be an add-on to development, but it should be, one core element. So I learned a lot from my own colleagues as well. And I do hope in this virtual talk, we will get to discuss this very topic, how to mainstream gender in climate action and how we can empower women in the domain of climate change as well. So without further ado, I would like to now invite Jeannette to give us her presentation. So Jeannette, over to you.
Thanks very much, Youngji. And indeed, it was inspiring to hear all of you. It's great to see so many women now at the IEU and to hear all of your thoughts about Women's Day. So thanks very much for that. And thanks very much for inviting me to speak a little bit to you today. I'm calling in from Hawaii, so I have to say good evening, but good evening to all of you in Korea as well. I would like to talk today about a paper we wrote recently, myself, my team, and others within the W+ Standard Advisory Council that has been getting a lot of attention. And I was very happy to see that IEU also recognized it might be something of interest to the Green Climate Fund. So next. First of all, again, just to set the stage a little bit here to talk about trends. Things are changing for gender and climate, whereas about 2 years ago, to be able to speak about gender and climate in the same sentence was very confusing to a lot of people. But now I think we see that very much we're starting to see policies and frameworks for gender equality are starting to come into more and more existence in the public climate finance mechanisms. And thanks to the GCF for that, which very much, I think, set the tone and inspired so many other organizations to follow. Indeed, we've also now have much more philanthropic, as well as the impact and gender lens investors who are getting on board and seeing that climate is an important and critical thing for them to support as well. We're also seeing companies and private investors who are supporting sustainable development goals and climate action, which I'll talk a little bit more about later. And so we're seeing a lot more diversity and a lot more numbers of funders and mechanisms interested in the nexus of gender and climate, but there's still gaps that exist, not to be surprised about that. I would say in some ways the climate finance group has limited knowledge of gender. The gender lens group, gender lens investors, also have a limited knowledge of the climate and climate sectors. And I would say right now, although there's some new discussion about merging those two agendas, which I don't think will ever exactly happen, but I would say that both groups are still missing the opportunities to support women's organizations, funds, enterprises, etc. And the evidence of that is to show the really incredible scant amount of funding that goes into gender and climate. And it's hard to put numbers to this because there's a lot of discussion about the fact that it's very difficult to differentiate climate funding from general development funding. And so we don't have really good numbers on this. I've put up here on the screen something that, and this is really old, this is already 2014, to show how little funding was even coming out of the philanthropic sectors. There's more recent, well, no, it's still 2014 data from OECD that said 3% of climate projects had gender as a principal objective, but 28% had integrated it as a secondary objective. So I think that's important. But the point I want to make here is that this is not working. We're all talking about the urgency to do something for climate, and yet we're still so far behind with the gender equality aspects of that. So we need to find a new way forward. Next. So here I want to present some possible new way forward, and that is maybe for those of you who are not aware of new developments within the carbon markets and the private voluntary carbon markets. So there's been, I think someone described it as an explosion of net zero commitments from companies and countries. I think there's an estimated 70% of all countries and companies will now be declaring their net zero commitments. This is huge. So in order to sort of anticipate what's coming, in the end of last year, there was a new task force pulled together with some business and private sector leaders from Fortune 500 companies and others who developed a task force on scaling the voluntary carbon market. This promise is to scale up 15 times, which this group considers vital in order to meet the 2050 targets. This group also sees that carbon market, the private voluntary carbon market, is a critical way to go, and also believes that whatever the UN does at the COP this year or otherwise will not be fast enough and will not be sufficient. So they look to the private carbon market for this. There's also an International Chamber of Commerce in Singapore that is also talking about how it wants to convene and become a supporter of carbon trade. And also all of this is not only talking about the trading of carbon assets, but also investing and bringing forward new funds and new mechanisms to invest in climate projects that will be delivering these carbon credits, and understanding that it's a challenge for many project developers to be able to put forth the capital in order to last, for example, 20 years if it's a forestry project. So this group has been identifying challenges, building consensus, and presenting blueprints of the guidelines for businesses ahead of what they see is going to be this surge in demand for carbon offsets. So this presents a new opportunity for the financial sector that they see ways to engage in building the market and connecting the demand with the supply. Next slide, please. However, and here's where I want to draw some cautionary note about this. Unless and until that group starts to understand that without the knowledge, skills, and networks of women, this is not going to be possible. And it's here to say, but let's look on the positive side of this. Let's see how this kind of new investments into climate finance could absolutely catalyze women's empowerment in ways that advance the climate results, but also in ways that advance the gender equality agenda, provide equal opportunities and benefits, and very importantly, to recognize, reward, and even compensate women for what I call women's unpaid care for the environment. During this year of COVID, we have seen more than ever the value of women's unpaid care in terms of how they take care of their families and their communities. We need to extend that definition to understanding how that kind of care is also going to provide for the environment, and is unrecognized and is unpaid for. It's a global good. So, okay, next slide. So I want to say that the private sector is promoting both of these things, gender equality and women's empowerment. Increasingly now it's seen as a good business practice. As I said, there's some understanding that even within impact investing, which is this growing sector that currently holds $26 trillion in publicly traded stocks and bonds, $5 trillion in private markets. So what's going on is impact investors, as they start to focus in on ESG, environmental, social, and governance indicators, they are turning to the SDGs, which are seen as kind of the global language, shared language of corporates and private sector investors. And they're looking at SDG 5 for gender equality and women's empowerment. And so they're starting to look at, there's a little bit of data about how that links to climate. And here on the right, I say that there was a study done by Berkeley Haas School of Business that women in leadership are more likely to proactively improve energy efficiency, invest in energy, and measure and reduce carbon emissions. And that we think that there's some or understanding that these investments can promote inclusive business models and ensure that women participate in the new green economy. Next slide. Here's a slide. This was quite astounding and surprising to many of us, that showed that this was a report of the 100 largest companies that have SDG commitments. And right on the top is the commitment to climate action. But right underneath number 1 is number 2, which is SDG 5 for gender equality and women's empowerment. This is significant and it's growing. However, we're rarely seeing these two things combined. Next slide. And so here's my question. What is the driver for gender? What is the carrot? What is the stick that's related to climate that's going to make a change here and move us from beyond that state of very scant funding and support for this? Well, I think to partly explain this is, climate action is driven by this very compelling global target-oriented policy. Zero net emissions is very clear. And that target allows companies and others to rally around it and to measure against it. And therefore, it provides incentives for action, and it has the carbon market structure, which I think is considered very convenient to companies. And it's an easy pathway for them to achieve the targets for climate action. However, in the gender world, we don't have anything similar to that. SDG 5 does not provide quantitative targets, and it doesn't have a compelling drive, therefore, that can move it forward. So my question here is can't we create synergies with this very concrete climate actions and climate targets that are also going to produce these gender and women's empowerment targets and meet those? And can we then use the same evidence-based approach as the carbon standards? We've seen a remarkable degree of integrity, not always, but in the carbon market in general. It's able to, rely on third-party independent verification measures. Could we do the same thing to design, measure, and report on gender equality, women's empowerment results instead of reporting on pledges? Now, why I say pledges is because many of the companies who are committed to gender equality are expressing it in signing on to a commitment such as the UN gender equality principles. But that's kind of letting them get away too easy, maybe. Signing on to a commitment or as a pledge doesn't have the same degree of force as a measurement of evidence-based of a result. So again, can the carbon market ecosystem be used to incentivize these actions? Can we see gender as a co-benefit of this existing carbon market that's drawing so much support and attention? Next slide. I would argue that we have to, and that if we don't address both of these things jointly, we run the risk of undermining both agendas. But by integrating the two, we can amplify the impact of both. But again, it needs to be a simple solution. It needs to be something that companies, for example, who will say, oh, we're not able to work, we're not able to deliver gender results because we don't know how to do so. We don't have the staff, we don't have the internal capacities. They may not have internal capacities for carbon emissions reductions either, but they've learned how to still be able to meet the targets they set for net zero emissions. So again, we need a low cost, a reliable, standardized mechanism that certifies results for women's empowerment and gender equality, similar to what the voluntary carbon market provides to companies and investors to meet their climate goals. Next slide. So here I'm going to start to talk about the W+ standard, which is something that WOCAN created back in about 2015. We, again, with the same idea about a carbon market, we learned about the carbon market. We had the same thoughts that can we use the similar approach as a carbon standard does to measure, report, quantify women's empowerment results and develop it as a monetized tradable asset as carbon credits are. So we did this for a few purposes, but one, we realized we needed to incentivize project developers, not only in climate, but across all sectors, because there just has not been enough seriousness taken for integrating gender. Despite all the capacity building and all the talking you'll hear, it's not actually been happening to a significant level. So could we incentivize action for that? And we did this by determining first, what is women's empowerment and how do we know what we're measuring? And we talked to women in rural Kenya and rural Nepal and asked them, what is women's empowerment? And they came up with these 6, what we call domains of time, income, asset, knowledge, education, health, food security, and leadership. So we said, okay, let's take each one of those, develop a methodology that combines qualitative and quantitative data and produces a method that's able to then generate data that can be spit out as an impact unit, just as a ton of carbon is in the environment sector. Since it's our standard and WOCAN is a women-driven with a mission for women's empowerment, we said we get to set the rules on this standard. And unlike carbon standards, we are going to require that anyone that uses the W+ has to return at least 20% of the revenue of the price of that unit that's sold has to be returned to women in the project community, and they get to do with that funding whatever they want to do with it. It's up to them. That's part of empowerment. Next slide. So what is this? I mean, we could call this a carbon gender blueprint. I mean, if the carbon market's going to call it a blueprint, we'll call it a carbon gender blueprint. We have now the way to apply the W+ standard as a label onto a ton of carbon, onto a carbon offset. We can do that with the VCS, the Verified Carbon Standard of Vera, which is used by so many climate-related projects around the world. We've simplified the process, we've streamlined the process. So now projects that are measuring carbon with the VCS can at the same time apply a W+ standard process to that. Of course, they can do so only if they're actually delivering benefits to women, which will be measured. It could be used in a wide kind of range of project types, from renewable energy, water supply, biogas, cook stove, and also just development projects that we could call adaptation projects or climate resilience projects. And again, what we're trying to do is provide this easy pathway for buyers, whether they be individuals or companies or investors or countries, easy way for them to be able to purchase credits to fulfill both of their targets for climate action and gender equality, and achieve that also the reporting on their impacts for ESG and SDG. Next slide. So right now we are the only gender certification that we received the UNFCCC's Women for Results Award at the COP in 2016 for the first project that we applied this to, which was a biogas digester in Nepal, we applied the time-saving domain method to that project and found out that women switching from the use of forest fuels, fuel wood, over to a clean energy from biogas was saving them 2.5 hours every single day of their lives. That was significant to them. It was transformational to them. In that case, we were able to sell some of those units, and then we returned we returned more than this, but we returned at least 20% back to those women's groups in the community. They then used that for whatever they liked. And it was very interesting that what they chose to use it for could be actually called climate adaptation activities. They used it for water supply, diversifying their agricultural kitchen garden crops, and also just building more things for the community, which in effect would be sustaining them in times of a climate crisis. I've mentioned already, we're including it with VCS Vera, and it's a way to quantify SDG 5 commitments, and as a cost-effective way for them to meet their targets. Next slide. So again, we're hoping that this new task force is going to recognize that it's possible in this 15-fold increase that they're proposing in the carbon markets, that they absolutely must also consider co-benefits in that process as they determine the new rules, the new pathways forward, the new investments into the pre-purchase of these carbon offsets would be tremendously helpful to women and women-owned enterprises who themselves are trying to operate climate mitigation projects. We do not see enough of those. We are hoping that, in fact, in the near future, we can start to see women not only as beneficiaries of these climate projects, but the owners and the managers and the ones that are also being able to generate and tap into some of the profits that are going to be generated by this upscaling of the private voluntary carbon markets. Next slide. So that's all I have, and I'm hoping you have some questions for me, and that Seble can give me some very challenging questions as well. So thank you very much, Auntie.
Thank you very much, Jeannette, for that very interesting presentation. We already have a number of questions received, but first, as we promised, we will give the floor to Seble. So Seble, go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Jeannette, for that presentation. I think there are very valuable information in there, and I think it's exciting to see that we are actually looking at providing equal opportunities and giving importance to that issue. The opportunity is what women are missing in many ways. The opportunities are not there, but one missed opportunity costs them a great deal. And then also, benefit sharing. Again, it's one area where consistently women are losing out on. They do all the work, but the benefits are not equally shared or even known to them. And then I like the fact that we are thinking about rewarding. If we don't recognize, we won't reward, but by giving recognition, then we are providing that space for reward or compensating for the work that has been put in. But I think these are important issues, and the unpaid care work, yes, linked to environment, but every other aspect of women's contribution in the day-to-day life is something that we are trying to see. But I hope the GCF, through its policy and maybe through some of the projects that we have been implementing, will be able to address some of the concerns that have been raised and will continue to be raised, moving the pledge to an actual intervention. Though in many of the works that we support through the Green Climate Fund, it is country driven, so you would need the level of commitment to be higher within countries. But going to the slides, I'll be presenting something about our policies. Can I have the next page? Yeah, thank you. So I'll just give a brief overview to our listeners today. What is GCF commitments to gender equality? What are our policy objectives and rationale? And I think it speaks to many of the issues that Jeannette has raised. And again, moving it from a pledge to action is through our policy requirements, which I'll discuss in a little bit, and what are the challenges that we'll still see. And I probably would assume that Jeannette, as she does the projects in countries, will face some of those challenges, but I'll speak to those in a short while. Next slide, please. So where does the commitment to gender equality for GCF come? It comes from our governing instrument, which we clearly says that we are going to be gender sensitive, and hopefully in the future we will go to a transformative approach. But currently we have that gender sensitivity as one of the things that we would like to see, and it requires us to mainstream gender across all interventions. So whatever we are doing, we'll make sure that we address gender issues. We have currently updated our gender policy, and it has made specific requirements in this one of all our partners as they come to us and submit a funding proposal. They will have to give us a gender assessment or an analysis, which gives us, the issues that were raised earlier. What do we know that men and women are doing in the communities as they try to mitigate or adapt to climate change? Where are the challenges? What are the opportunities? And then that's the assessment part of it. And then based on that, we just don't want to know what is happening, but we want action. So we want a gender action plan. So these are very key requirements that we have put in the policy as it was revised. And then we follow through with that in agreements that will be signed with our partners. And so it is made into an agreement that they will have to comply with. Next slide, please. So what is the gender policy's objective? Again, the objective is to support climate change interventions through a comprehensive gender approach. And we also would like to see innovations. And I think what we just saw now could be some of the things that we can consider, but we want to make sure that it has a comprehensive approach. It's not looking at one side of things and not the other, but as a whole. And then we want to do it when we develop projects that are of mitigation nature or adaptation, but it has to have that gender element of it. And we want to minimize social and gender-related, climate-related risks as we do it. But again, we also want to focus on reducing the gender gaps through climate investments. Again, that mainstream gender equality. So throughout the development process of our funding proposals, we would want to see that approach has been used. But what is the rationale behind this? We understand, yes, climate change impacts all our communities, but we do understand that it exacerbates the existing gender inequalities. So we might all be affected, but if gender inequality has been there, those that are affected by that will be more affected. We take note that there are gender relations, roles, responsibilities, but that influence men's and women's access to decision, assets, resources, and information and knowledge. We acknowledge that there would be differences, and that's why we want to approach it as a comprehensive manner. And if we want to be sustainable and equitable, we can only do it if we can have gender equality and women's empowerment considered fully. But while we recognize that communities will be vulnerable, we do also recognize and understand that they do have a role to play in the solution. They are already doing some things, but we want to amplify that through our project interventions. But we do recognize that there is something that is already be done by the communities. So next slide, please. So having said that, if that is what we want to do, and if that is our rationale, then what is it that we want to do when we support programs and projects through the fund? The GCF works through accredited entities. We don't do direct implementation, so we have partners out there, but at accreditation, there are certain things that we would require. One of them is on gender. So whoever comes to us, whether it's private sector or public sector, if they want to partner with the GCF or if they want to become accredited entities, they will have to demonstrate that they have the gender policies in place that can help them comply with our policies. And they have the competencies and capacities to design and implement projects in the way that we think they should be done. So being able to do the gender assessments and action plans. So the entry to partnering with the GCF will require that to happen in the beginning. So yes, we do understand that not all will have the capacity. Some will have difficulties in meeting this accreditation requirement. But again, having recognized that there are capacity limitations, then that we have a pool of fund to help our partners get that capacity to be able to deliver. So I think maybe that's an incentive that we are trying to provide our partners. But as I said earlier, for funding proposals, any kind of funding proposals that we receive, you will have to have a gender assessment, you will have to have a gender action plan, and we will be following up on implementation, and we'll look at reporting. This is external facing, if you like, but internally also we are trying to see whether we are also promoting gender equality within the organization. This guide has been provided, this manual has been developed to help our partners in developing their funding proposals. What does the gender assessment or action plan need to have? I think we have provided this guide, but we also know there are many literature out there, many experiences out there that can help our partners develop the kinds of funding proposals that they should be submitting to us. Next slide, please. I wouldn't go into the details of what the gender analysis and assessment look like, but this is an important element for us, and this is where we are facing the most challenge, and I'll speak to challenges later, but it is something that can tell us, again, who is doing what where within that specific sector where we are focusing. It's based on that understanding that we can develop our gender action plan. So this is a critical part of the work, and all the barriers that we see as the project is being implemented. And I think this is critical because it is about recognizing who's there doing what. And I think we miss out on engaging women or meaningfully engaging women because they don't seem to be in the picture. And I think when we require this to be part of the work, this is what it does. They will have to undertake stakeholder consultations where they will have to talk to women and men, and then even further identify who within women is much more vulnerable. We find in many of the assessments that we receive, female heads of households come out as the more disadvantaged communities within women. So they will have to dig deeper, and they're not going to give us a picture, a superficial picture. We do have that in-depth analysis that needs to be done to tell us how is this project, whether it's a mitigation project or an adaptation project, how is it going to bring women, if they have already been identified as vulnerable, how is it going to help them participate, help them get the benefits? What are the underlying causes for the inequalities that you see? Because you might be able to say they lack finance, but why do they lack finance to do any of the work? There are some cultural norms that need to be addressed, so it's not a superficial way of addressing it, but it is looking at how we drill down deeper into why those inequalities exist, and are we positioning the projects to be able to address that. So this analysis is the key document that guides us into discovering what is the issue. And then this is the building block for us to be designing the gender action plans. So stakeholder engagement is an important element to this work. And it will be done at different levels, but this is something that can help us identify what we need to do. So next slide, please. So the gender action plan, as I said earlier, is a requirement, and we do have a template that people, accredited entities will have to look to, but it is based on, as I said, on the gender assessments that were done. But we also try to say, what's your baseline? What's your target? Sometimes countries have determined what their targets are, so we see a lot of 30%. Embedded in national documents, national strategies, but we want to know that the targets are ambitious and are pushing the boundaries and not sticking to what is the norm. We want to see indicators, the right indicators. We want to know that there are qualitative as well as quantitative indicators in there. And then, financial resources. They might identify a list of projects. Some would say it is embedded in other activities and all that, but we try to make sure that at least some, if not all, of the actions that are identified have a clearly targeted budget that could help support women address some of the challenges that have been identified through the assessment. Dedicated gender expertise, that is consistently what we ask for. I know many people think that if there are 50-50 women and men in a meeting that we have achieved what we have set ourselves to do, but it is more than that. There are issues that need to be discussed and the issues that I've raised earlier. So we do expect our accredited entities to have gender expertise to support the designed gender action plan to be implemented, monitored, and if it needs improvement, adjustments, that is taken care of. But we need somebody to really have an eye on the gender action plan. I know there could be discussions about the gender experts being sidelined and all that, but what we are trying to do is make sure that it is not forgotten and that it is part of the process. And then we do have annual reporting that is done on the action plan, so we will be monitoring through that. Next slide, please. So I'll speak to some of the challenges that we face. The opportunities, through the policy, we have the opportunity to be saying, okay, if you want to be working with the GCF, you go through the accreditation, and then once you are accredited at the funding proposal stage, whether you are a private sector or public sector, you will be expected to provide gender action plans. And then I think so far we have been very good with having these requirements fulfilled, even though there are some gaps in the beginning. They all are expected to report annually on the gender action plan. And we hope that the requirements that we have put for them through the GCF, as they become accredited through the GCF, it becomes the normal practice for them, even as they are not working with the GCF. Looking forward, I hope they do see the benefits of having done this exercise and having worked on this, and that hopefully will change the scenario out there, and it improves the understanding and the delivery of each country or of each organization towards addressing the commitments that are made at countries at the different levels. Do try to provide guidance documents, but as I said, we don't want to duplicate things that are out there. There are many guidance available on how to do gender assessments and action plan. Yes, there would be gaps on linking climate and gender, but we do provide those kinds of supports. Challenges again, we see different kinds of assessments and in terms of quality, the gender assessments and action plans, depending on the kinds of organizations that we are dealing with. So not everything is rosy and happy. We do have challenges in getting good assessments. It could be for the lack of gender expertise within, or the kinds of expertise that they have in-house. You want your action plans to speak to what could be achieved and what is possible, and not a list of things that you want to see but are not able to deliver. So we do have issues with clearer outcome statements, outputs, targets, indicators, and all that. Stakeholder consultations, you would want it to be broader and all-inclusive, and also making sure that what is said in the stakeholder consultations and what have been identified as needs and priorities are reflected clearly in the action plan. So we do have some challenges around that, but sorry, the chat room is blocking my slide. And yeah, I think the APR reviews the annual performance reports. As projects take time in being implemented, we do see some gaps in how they are actually implementing the gender action plans. But That doesn't mean it will not be done. That means it will be delayed, but that's something that we wouldn't want to see in our projects. Next slide. So what would be the key message? I know we always make gender equality is a smart thing to do, and we focus on the economic side to be able to sell it and attract more people to speak. But at the end of the day, it's a human rights issue. It's a rights issue, and I think most of the from the funding proposals that we see in the countries that are represented, we know that countries have committed to gender equality. Many of them have committed economic empowerment of women, where many countries have committed to gender equality. And I think that's the driving force. That should be the driving force for everyone to act on. And GCF, I mean, through the work that we are doing, are trying to help countries fulfill that policy commitment in a way. We shouldn't be looking at gender sensitivity. I mean, I think we have made a lot of progress on that, I would say, way past looking at, oh, we do understand gender inequality exists, but we want to know that we have gone to a stage where we are trying to change the norms that still persist, that subjugates women to the positions that they are, that doesn't provide the opportunities that they need to have. The right to education, the right to health, the right to be involved in any sector that they deem they want to be. There are many constraints that are out there, and that should be what we would be looking at, and then change the scenario and not settle for, this is what exists and this is what we should be working in. I mean, the other point, yes, we do need to address the practical problems that there are, the practical challenges. If there's no water, if there's no fuel, people will have to live. They have to feed their families. We do need to address those, but we need to go beyond that and say, how do we make sustainable change? How do we address the strategic needs that are out there? If we can address those, then maybe we have made a lot more progress than we have now. But since we are a funding agency and we do provide finances, I think the value of our gender experts out there in any of the countries to help us develop the right kind of assessments, the right kind of gender action plans, engaging women's organizations that are out there in countries that can do a better job or support us in doing a better job in delivering on gender equality and women's empowerment is key. I think with that, I will close my session and happy to receive questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Seble. So indeed, we've received a number of questions and very good questions indeed as well. So first, maybe I will direct this question to Jeannette so that you could catch your breath a little bit before I come to you. So yes, Jeannette. So our first question comes from Archie, my colleague from the IEU, and he says, it's interesting and probably surprising that climate finance may lag behind in being gender transformative and gender sensitive. Are there any other fields from which climate finance could learn, such as public health, maybe like a subfield in development? Would you like to take that question, Jeannette?
Thanks for the question, Archie. It's interesting because I think at WOCAN we've been able to have one foot in the climate finance world and one foot in the gender lens investing world. And so I don't know if you call that a sector, but it's something that's growing. It's been interesting because the gender lens investors came at this problem kind of more from a typical, I almost want to say feminine perspective on this, which is to think about funding things like girls' education, reproductive health. When I've talked to my climate finance friends with those suggestions, they think that's a little off base. But I think it could be transformative in the way that Seble's been talking about as well. Problem is some of those solutions are long-term in nature and we're all wondering how much time we've got. But it's interesting to see both of these groups of finance holders and investors start to think about what perspective they bring to this. So that's the only one that I'm very familiar with.
All right, Seble, do you want to comment on this maybe? since we are all working in climate finance, do you have a view on this?
I mean, I would say there are many lessons, but are the lessons comprehensive enough for us to say this is where you should focus on? And there is a linkage when you address climate-related issues, the health comes into play. If we are working in a water sector, yes, there are gender issues in water sector, but the way we address that water sector will be wider than just the water sector. It goes into education. It goes into services that the usual one is the water committees. But how do you engage in a water community? A water community where you are not empowered. So it goes back to assertiveness and things like that. So you pick one, but it has linkages with others. And how do we? That's why I was saying comprehensive approach to addressing gender. There are interlinkages. With water, again, you can talk about violence against women. Fetching water is one activity that women do, but then fetching water from a long distance then has another dimension where that is a potential threat. So then you go into the legal system. Is it ready to entertain those kinds of things? So it will not be a one-off, but it would maybe require us to link with others that are working in the sectors to make the kind of change that we want. So we might not solve it all on our own, but we might be able to see when we do our assessments who would be the right partner to help us to get there. So yeah, solutions can come from different corners, but it is for us to be able to see where those corners or where those partners should come from.
Okay, thank you. So before we get into these very specific questions about the W+ standard itself and how it can be applied in different settings, this question from Anathea. So Jeannette, can we use parity between men and women at each level of management, each type of employment as a quantitative marker for SDG 5? Can you quickly comment on this? So parity 45 to 55% between men and women.
I think parity is one aspect. I mean, there's never a guarantee in my mind that parity at the higher level necessarily trickles down to the most vulnerable populations. We have too many examples in the world where even the female bosses can be very non-inclusive. So for the W+ standard, we're more interested in measuring at the base of the pyramid, if I can use that talk, but at what goes on at the community level. It's certainly impacted by what is happening at the management level, but I would say parity itself is probably not the best indicator of gender equality and women's empowerment.
Thank you for that. And we have this question from Deborah. She's our new behavioral science expert on the team. So she says, in impact investing, enterprises tend to fundamentally be much more inclusive than in previous private sector practices. So in the case of lacking capacity, what do you see as the biggest behavioral or non-behavioral barriers to more fluid integration? So first, I give the floor to Jeannette.
So Deborah, you know this, but I mean, a lot of what I hear from impact investors is metrics, metrics, metrics. That's all they ever want to talk about. And I think they're still struggling, and everybody wants a simple metric, and everybody wants to agree to a metric that's simple to use. And so this is, right now I hear a lot of discussion around this with the belief that if they could just get the right metric, that may provide that kind of motive and incentive to change. But that's my limited knowledge about that.
Okay, Seble, would you like to come in, like on this behavioral and non-behavioral aspect?
For me, in general, when we talk about gender equality, it's more the behavioral, and I don't know if you can segment it and say this behavior demonstrates this one, but the behavior is then seen in action. How are people behaving? How are people? And so for me, the behavioral is a much deeper and then a much continuous action that needs to be looked into. So I don't know in that perspective how that would be tracked, but I think beyond the numbers, the qualitative aspect is what is important, and being able to track that is something that we are trying to see. I mean, the empowerment index is one that you would want to look at, but again, that would be something hard to pinpoint, but that's an important element to look at.
Okay, thank you. So now let's get into some GCF related work and policy. So Andreas asks, given that GCF also provides readiness support, how could GCF readiness support be measured through this W+ standard framework, perhaps? Seblewongel?
Andreas is putting me on the spot on this one, but it is something that I would have to look at and see how it can be measured, but maybe he's the one who should help me with that in measuring the impacts. But I suppose, you know, the readiness is, as far as my understanding goes, is getting our partners to either develop the kinds of work that they need to do. It could be in their preparation of readiness proposals and the gender assessments along with that, and the gender action plans. And I would say that they could explore on how they can engage, I don't know, with WOCAN if possible. But as I said, this is a country-driven exercise, so it's in the hands of the countries to identify who they work with. But I think that I see a potential for them to work with different actors that can actually deliver on or design the kinds of projects that can deliver on actually getting the benefits in the hands of women, as they are the ones who are not actually reaping the benefits from the various interventions. So readiness can help them develop the kinds of projects that could actually deliver on the benefit side of things more on. So they could explore with that.
Okay. I will give
on that, Youngji. Also, the point about Sebli, you mentioned that all projects need to do a baseline. I think the baseline is a critical component, and I think Andreas would agree that we don't know if the projects are bringing any degree of change to these communities unless we know where we started from. And the readiness stage seems like a very appropriate place to perhaps put that baseline into place that you're then going to revisit. My fear would be is what's happening, I don't know this, is that maybe as entities are trying to get accredited and meet your conditions, and they're saying, okay, baseline, do that, check. But do they ever go back at some later stage and do any kind of measurement against the baseline? I think that's the critical point.
So I'm not the right person to be speaking to how accreditation is done, but I do understand that re-accreditation takes place, and I'm hoping that at re-accreditation then we are revisiting the beginning and somewhere after they finish where they were and where they're at. So that could be, but I don't know if they go into the details of what their baseline in terms of how they want to achieve gender, because at accreditation what they're looking at is whether they have the required I don't know, policies and competencies to be able to deliver on the GCF commitments. But I do agree baselines are important, and I think it is a very big struggle within the projects itself to come up with the right baseline to measure. But we'll see how we can improve on that, but it is one challenging area, establishing the right baseline. And then, you know, you want to set targets and, you know, you want to have the right indicators, but then are you really setting the right baseline and setting the right targets? So it is a challenge area. And with data not being available in many of the project sites, particularly on gender and some specific areas, then it becomes even harder. So the project will have to start from zero if there's no data, but then is that zero baseline the right one? It's kind of hard. So there are difficulties in establishing the right baseline, because there are always a challenge with baseline data and data regarding gender equality.
Jeannette, are you satisfied for now?
I think if we can make a dialogue out of this, it makes it interesting. I think this is exactly what GCF should be putting its readiness fund to. If there isn't any baseline, then make a commitment to setting that baseline. It's absolutely critical, simply because, as I said, you won't know of your success without it. And you know, the kind of data that we use within the W Plus is the process is we generate that data with women of the community. We often go in and train them as enumerators. We have an app that lets them use their smartphone to gather that. And it's a bunch of questions, and it's even empowering for women at that level to be paid as enumerators, because nobody's ever put them in charge of the research data. They're always on the subject end of the research. So, I mean, I think it's something worth investing in as part of a readiness fund. And I think it's also useful as a design. I mean, something like the W Plus, and maybe there are others as well, is it's also a project design methodology, right? It sets the indicators for where you have to go, and it gives you this very concrete way to measure. So we're trying to take some of the heavy lifting off of the project itself and say, here's how you do it, right? And here we're going to give you this method. You can tweak it. The standard is tweakable, all the questions and the methods. And even if there's a new area for a new domain that we missed, and I'm sure we did, like some people have been telling us, why don't we have a new domain just for gender-based violence? We could do that, right? So I think that's the point, is we're trying to help these guys with their data challenges, right? I think that's
and I do agree that it is important, and as the fund, so I don't know if this readiness or the funding proposal that should be doing that. Again, I would say readiness is something that the countries decide, I need money to do 1, 2, 3, and that's what it is available for. Through the funding proposals, we do expect them to have a baseline, and they do have baselines, and they do targets, but I'm sure it can be done better. But the decision to engage in those activities, because the GCF works through accredited entities, the entry to doing that is through the accredited entity. So an established relationship with an accredited entity is something that can help the countries, set the right baselines and then measure them. But it is something that we do collect, but I'm just saying that it needs to be refined as we go along. Yeah. But I do agree that baseline is important, and targets, and we do have projects that give the power to women to be part of the measurements, measuring the baselines and things like that with tools and technology. But I always believe there is always room for improvements.
Okay, Jeannette, Seble, if you may allow me, given the fact that we still have a number of questions from the audience, so maybe we could address some of these questions before we close. And I thank the audience for staying with us, although it's past 6 p.m. actually. If you stay with us for just a little bit longer, we would come to your questions, at least for briefly. Okay, so this question for Jeannette. So more specific about the W Plus standard, is there a profile of companies, particular sectors or company size, that show interest in this W Plus standard? And have you found that this framework works in all kinds of contexts? So not just geographical, but institutional context versus community-based projects. So Jeannette?
Yeah, thanks, Virginia asked this one. Yeah, I think we, as I said, we really did develop it for community-based projects. We've had some pretty large companies who use it, and in this case, they were using it more as the CSR projects. It's a very large solar installation company, but they have to do CSR projects around the thing. So they were using it. So I don't think there's any size. There's also no minimum size that's required for the W Plus. And that's for the project developers. Of course, for the buyers, it's just wide open for any kind of buyer as well. We're waiting for the one really big buyer, which I think we may be on the verge of, but it's also open for individuals.
Okay, just one more question. So how would the disbursement payments look like under this framework? So yeah, could you elaborate on this, Jeannette?
Yeah. It's a good question. We leave it up to the project developer because we're not in a position to determine, we don't know the context. But I will say, Andreas, that it is part of what the auditor looks like. We need to make sure that those payments are actually received by women. That could go very wrong for us. So what's required in the second round of monitoring is that there has to be a proof that women have in fact received the money and then been able to decide on how it's used.
Okay, Andreas, that answered your question. All right. There was a specific question for Seble with regards to the GCF gender policy. So let me ask the question to Seble. Yes, the principles say that the gender policy would also be aligned with priorities of the country on gender. From your perspective, though, wouldn't this limit the transformative element of our own GCF gender policy and limit us in what could be done in projects in these countries? So Seble, that's a question from Andreas. Yeah, go ahead.
So yeah, it could limit, but as far as we have seen so far, and I think there is a recognition that all countries or different countries are at different levels of development when it comes to gender. I mean, policy commitments aside, many of the assessments that we have seen really talk about translating the policies into implementation a gap, a big one. Commitment-wise, maybe in some sectors with few countries, I've seen that they have limitations for women to engage in employment opportunities. But in many, they are committed to women's empowerment and gender equality. The compliance with our policy and their own policies so far has not limited the kind of work that we can do. But I could say that for all the projects that we have approved, we could have pushed the boundaries. There is more that we can do with each country, but I think we want to recognize that there are limitations in countries. We don't want them to overcommit, because as a person who has worked on gender for many years, I don't want to see many activities listed out for me. I want to understand that they have understood the magnitude of the problem. And I said, when we say comprehensive, making women join a meeting is not going to solve it. Or training women is not going to solve the problems that they have. There are underlying causes that need to be solved for them to progress further. So we will go a long way if we can address the issues in a comprehensive manner. So women cannot go to school, girls cannot go to school, or women will abstain their kids from going to school because they need help in the household. But that is a symptom of a bigger problem in the household. If the projects can focus on addressing that underlying cause, why are women overburdened? Why are we talking about women not having time to do 1, 2, 3 to help themselves, to help their communities better? If we don't understand those, then we are adding to the problem. So I think the minimum, if I say the minimum, if they can deliver on those things, then we can make headways in many other aspects. So as far as I'm concerned, from what I have seen, what they have been able to commit, if they can deliver on that, we would have made a lot of progress. But again, I recognize that there are certain limitations in countries for policies, but within the policies that they have and within the commitments and with what they have committed through their gender action plans, if they can implement them, then we would have made a lot of progress. So yeah, there would be some challenges there, but I haven't seen it in terms of how it has been translated into the projects that we have designed.
Okay, so Seble, there is this question. I'm going to collate some questions. So how is GCF working to build the capacity of national gender experts in the area of climate financing and green funding? And together with that question, perhaps we can tackle another national capacity related question. So Muralita is from Sri Lanka. So she asks, how does gender perspective help the economic growth and development of a nation in the SDG era? So can we tackle those two questions? So first, Seble, and then I'll ask Jeannette. Go ahead.
So the capacity, again, there are two ways of doing it. One is by using the readiness financing to say, oh, these are the capacity gaps I have, and this is how I would want to address it and tap into that part of the portfolio. But the other one is the capacity building work in terms of training or making the policies known to our partners. Those are the kinds of things that we try to do through our policy work. So there has been work with different regions through our GCP Division of Country Programming, where they organize discussions with our entities to make them to clarify the policy requirements. But there are also one-on-ones when, as the funding proposals come through to the GCF, some of our accredited entities do have difficulties in understanding what are the requirements. So we do have one-on-ones to explain, and as much as possible, what the requirements of the policies are. So we do try to approach it in different ways. We do have template that we have out there on our website that could help guide our accredited entities to be able to meet our requirements. But these are some of the ways we are trying to support our partners in addressing them. But we do take 3 ways of doing it.
Jeannette, do you want to quickly comment on this question?
Yeah, I'm going to turn this around a little bit. Maybe it's a little controversial, but you know, I really believe that the GCF could be a transformational force for good. And I think I hear you, Seble, when you talk about the challenges. I've also mainstreamed gender in the male-dominated environment organizations. I know a lot about how difficult that is, but I really feel now is the time for bold, new visions. And you know, GCF, if anybody, you've got the funding, you've got the integrity, you've got, I mean, people do what you tell them to do. So yes, it's true, it's got to be country driven, but I mean, I hear from everybody who's approaching you and, oh, we have to do this because the GCF requires it. So if the GCF would raise the bar, I believe that you could really start to do something interesting and transformational. We're all waiting for that. And how that would build the capacity for gender experts? Well, it would build a demand. It would build a demand. Then you would start to see the capacity also develop. And then you would start to see the existing group of gender experts that are out there start to have a lot of work to do. So you've already done, I mean, GCF has already done that by being this grand pioneer in its requirements for accreditation. And now I think it needs to keep going and take it up to the next step in terms of projects. That's my opinion.
Okay, thank you very much for that, Jeannette. So another question regarding time savings, this aspect of time savings. So yeah, how can the AEs be incentivized to pick up on this aspect, time savings, but a lot of women report on the issue of time poverty, you know, and actually invest in time use analysis? Would it help as a baseline exercise if the GCF demanded these from the AEs, accredited entities? And could it also be seen as a country-driven exercise, for example, including these analyses as pilot exercises or entry points through adaptation mitigation results frameworks? So, Jeannette?
Well, I'm thrilled that time poverty has been taken seriously, because I think most of us didn't realize that for many years, right? And it's the one thing across, and we've seen it at COVID more than ever, right? But any woman in the entire universe you talk to has a shortage of time. So I think it's also something everybody relates to. It's interesting to me, I didn't know GCF is requiring it, that's great. Nobody yet has talked about what I was talking about, which is the idea of trying to use this market-driven approach. And maybe it doesn't apply. I've certainly had those conversations with GCF as well. But you know, the idea of the incentive, back to the behavioral change, how do we incentivize this kind of incorporation of things and make change? Make it profitable. I mean, the whole idea around something like W+ standard is that the project developers are going to generate profits and revenues when they do the right thing and they sell their carbon units. And I know not everybody is selling carbon, but they might be thinking about it now that the market and the price is going to start to rise significantly. So I would keep an eye on that and think of it as an opportunity.
Okay, thank you. And I think this is the last question we have. So during the talk, we talked about the challenge in gender expertise. So what is being done about it? So Seble, do you want to take this question?
So I will still go back to, the readiness is something that entities can use to fill that gap. But in my personal opinion, as I had indicated earlier, accreditation requires it that they come prepared, have the policies, competencies, and capacities. So at the funding proposal stage, my job is to have on my table gender assessments that meet the requirement. And I know for sure that could be achieved if they have their gender expertise in place. I will not dictate how the AE does it, but the expectation is that they will have an expert leading that work. So any conversation with us will say, okay, can I talk to your gender expertise or the gender expert that is leading this work? Because yeah, we can discuss with the whole project team, but looking at the kind of assessment that we have received and looking at what they are able to provide, we do engage with their gender experts. If they don't have it, what I have seen is that they will hire a firm, a gender consultant to help them develop that. But again, it doesn't stop there for us because yes, that's a one-off exercise where they can have the gender action plan and gender assessments developed. But what we would require them is to have budget for a gender expert attached to their gender action plan. So they will have somebody on board to help with the implementation, monitoring, and following up on that. So again, this is different from when I was a project officer doing a project. I would be responsible, but here, accreditation is what is supposed to help us take care of all the requirements. And then at the funding proposal level, yes, if they have an issue, they will use the readiness to develop that. But at the funding proposal stage, and while we approve it, we try to make sure that they have gender expertise in place, sufficient enough to help them mainstream it, implement the gender action plan and follow through with the implementation and provide whatever support will be required during the course of the project implementation.
Thank you. And this one last question. So we talked about collecting baseline data and so on. So, but this participant says there is limited funding for data collection. With this data, the issues remain moot. So could the GCF consider providing preparatory funding for conducting detailed gender analysis in a similar way that the GEF, the Global Environment Facility, provides funding for project preparation? So, Seble, I think this has to go to you again. Yeah.
So again, I will say that, again, the readiness is the pool that you can use to do that. The funding proposal stage, unless you don't want that that funding proposal to be presented at the, it depends on when you want to present it to the board, but I think what we are trying to encourage our partners as they develop their funding proposals is, if that is going to be done, they can allocate a sum within the gender action plan to say, we will be collecting, and we have been supporting those kinds of initiatives in the funding proposals. Some of them would need to do further gender analysis because they do it at a programmatic level, but they haven't identified the project. So what we make sure that they do is that they have a budget in place to conduct project or site-specific gender assessments and action plans that would include the collection of baseline data. So we do provide within the funding proposal opportunities for collecting those kinds of information that would support them to implement the project better.
Okay, we went 20 minutes over. So now I would like to ask Jeannette if she would like to give any final closing words before I do the closing. So Jeannette, go ahead.
Thanks for the chance. I think I said my piece when I just made a call to GCF to be something bold. I feel like, some of I know it's difficult, Seble. I know it's a very bureaucratic process, and I just urge you and others, and supported with Andreas and the great team at IEU, to think of really strategically, how do we really move this forward in a big way? We're all there to help you and to support you and hold your back in any way that we can do it. Just go for it. That's my final word. Thanks, Yanti.
All right, Seble, before I close, would you like to say a quick word response?
I would not respond, but I would appreciate the support that is there, and we will try our best to do more. I know there is a potential for that, and I do appreciate Jeanette's interventions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for that. So Beatrice, if we could just put up the closing slides. Yeah. Okay, so in closing, we would like to bring to your attention some of our recent IEU communications products. So we do IEU blogs. These are very short, fun to read pieces as a means to disseminate our learnings in a fun way. And so the latest blog that we did just before B28, we did this data outlook blog. So if all proposed projects were to be approved at B28, what would it look like in terms of data and portfolio and so on? So this is a great read. You can scan the QR code in front of you and you can take a look at the blog. So next, please. And then we have our own podcast series called The Evaluator. And the latest episode talked about how to convince farmers to buy a crop insurance scheme for climate resilience. So this also includes some discussions about behavioral science. So Deborah, maybe you may find it interesting. So next, please. Okay, and we do a lot of learning and working papers from the IEU. And the latest that we have talks about how to bridge the gap between complexity science and evaluation. And it proposes a new analysis tool to score complexity in climate action projects. And so definitely you can check it out. Next, please. And then importantly, we just concluded our important evaluation on the adaptation portfolio and approach of the Green Climate Fund. This was submitted in time for B28, the 28th meeting of the GCF board, which was held just last week. And so you can take a look at our detailed final report on our website, or again, by scanning the QR code in front of you. Okay, so that said, next, please. We thank you very, very much for joining us today. Many, many thanks to Jeannette and Seble, and also all of you who stayed with us until this very end. I felt your enthusiasm for the topic and so on, so it's been great. And also, if I may, I give my shout out to my comms colleagues, Eben, Beatrice, Asha, who were instrumental in organizing this talk with Jeannette and Seble, and also the head of IEU AI, Andreas, for giving us the encouragement that we needed to put together this talk. So thank you all very much. We hope to see you again. Please stay tuned for our next virtual talk in April. You will get an invite from us again. So until we see you again, please stay safe and have a great day and great evening wherever you might be.